So what I want to do today is to concentrate on three major topics shown on this slide. First, know your enemy and the enemy gets a vote. Some of you will recognize those phrases, I'm sure. Here I'm going to explain what I found out about on who made the decisions for the communist North Vietnam during the American War, as they called it, what motivated them, and what made them think that they could take on the US and win. And then I'll discuss what my book explains about the strategy that those leaders developed, its major features, what it depended on, and how it did or did not work. And finally, relationships matter. What I mean by that is a major theme of my book was that the relationship between the American civilian and military leaders were abysmal, and that it was a major reason why we just could not choose or execute a strategy that may have worked for the US stated goal of defending South Vietnam from communist aggression. In this last part, I'll share how and why those relationships were so poor and how they affected US war efforts. So what did we know or not know about our enemy? As this slide shows, who the US decision makers thought were running the show and in charge were not. Thus, in the picture on the upper right, Ho Chi Minh and Giap were not the decision makers, but a man by the name of Le Duan, shown in between Ho and Giap at the Politburo meeting in the picture, was. Now, what is significant about that is that Le Duan was entirely different in his background, personality, and attitude than both Ho and Giap. Above everything, he was a hardliner communist who believed that the only method of achieving their aim of unification was through the use of force. To him, the demonstration of restraint was a demonstration of weakness. To him, negotiation was only a way to delay and gain time to be able to concentrate the necessary force to conquer the South militarily. Indeed, he had blamed Ho for selling out at the Geneva Convention in 1954 to the Chinese and others, arguing that he should have continued to wage war against the French to gain full independence for all of Indochina as well as Vietnam, instead of accepting a division that later depended on elections or further revolutionary action. Now, the reason why he had by 1959 or so gained favor in the Vietnamese Communist Central Committee is that he argued that there was only one way to achieve unification against the Southern regime under Ngo Dinh Diem and its American sponsor. And that was through the use of force rather than the more subtle means of intimidation, assassination, political coercion, and the slow use of guerrilla conflict, as both Ho and Giap had argued. What made others listen to him, and a main reason why Ho and Giap could not ignore him, is that Le Duan had served as a major leader in the South during the French War. And he had remained behind there after the others were relocated north. Now, Le Duan was also a master in gaining the support of others in the party who were of similar views. For example, shown at the bottom right are two such Politburo members, a man by the name of Le Duc Tho and Nguyen Chi Tan. To had served with Le Duan in the South during the French War. He was a close associate and would become his right-hand man in the Politburo. He was a great political organizer, and he would help gain a clique of others who were willing to sideline Ho as long as he could be kept as a figurehead. Tan was a Southerner by birth and had gained his reputation as an army leader and was of similar militant views as Le Duan. He would help gain the support of key generals in the army who thought Giap was too cautious and had a monumental ego far larger than his worth after the French War. Tan would also devise how to execute a strategy that would take on the Americans with North Vietnam regulars while using the Viet Cong units to defeat the South's army. He would also become the initial head of the headquarters and the director of operations in the South. In sum, it was Le Duan, along with these loyal compatriots who thought like him, who would be making the key decisions about waging war in the South. And he was hell-bent on using every military means at his disposal to unify the two Vietnams with the use of military force. All righty, where are you? There you go. Now, this slide shows some of Le Duan's key military decisions between 1954 and September of 1964. Le Duan had directed the actions of the Viet Minh, as I mentioned, against the French in the southern portion of Vietnam during the First Indochina War. As shown on the map here in the upper middle of the screen, this shows the disposition of the Viet Minh forces during the French War and what made up South Vietnam afterwards. Now, in '54, in accordance with the Geneva Accords, those Viet Minh forces in the South were to move north. Most of them did. But about 10,000 of them, made up of both political personnel and troops, did not. They stayed back as a nation the whole, so to speak, in case the elections that were called for at the Geneva Convention for 1956 to reunify all of Vietnam did not take place. The task for the military troops was to continue to hide in and maintain base camps that they had built during the French War. These are noted on this map in red circles with X's in them. To prepare for these were there and maintained to prepare for the use of force should the elections fail. The mission for the others was to set up political cells to shadow South Vietnamese organizations and gain support of the people for their cause. So in '54, as everybody moved north, Le Duan made the decision to remain behind to organize and direct these main tasks. As an indication of the kind of person he was, he spent much of his time in the Mekong Delta in a sampan, which he used as his command post. In 1957, he left the South to go to Hanoi, where he became a member of the Central Committee because of the work that he had done in the South. When he got there, he began drafting a paper to convince the party leadership to militarize the struggle in the South to save the movement there. To begin that more militant movement, the North now decided, based upon Le Duan's efforts and recommendations, that it would form in the South an organization called the People's Liberation Front, is shown at the bottom here in the middle, with subordinate front headquarters throughout South Vietnam. A major mission of that headquarters was to expand the communist political and military organizations in the South and begin more militant actions against their armed forces. The Politburo also ordered the beginning of the building of what later would be called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, shown here. And they sent some 500 what they called regroupees into South Vietnam to assist in the tasks of the forces there. By the way, these regroupees were former Viet Minh who had fought in the South. They were now North Vietnamese Army soldiers, and they had been Southern born and had moved north in '54. They would be instrumental in the task to maintain and build new base camps, delineated here on this map, to include new ones spread throughout Vietnam as they could make them, and along the border regions, along Cambodia and Laos. Now, it's important, I think, to note here, as I do in the book, that before North Vietnam began its major operations in the South, they had prepared the battlefield there thoroughly. And when they launched their first major offensive in '64, which I'll show you shortly, they had set up major base camps throughout the South and along the borders, from which their main military forces that infiltrated from the North could not only operate against the South Vietnamese and later the Americans, but could seek refuge in areas outside of the borders of the South if need be. Now, this slide depicts the major strategic decisions that Le Duan, again, made that resulted in the North's 4 major military offensives from 1964 to the end of 1965. The far left map is of their '64 offensive, whose aim was to defeat the South before the US could deploy major ground combat forces to prevent that from happening. It shows how, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail that now was fairly well developed from its beginning in '59, Duan infiltrated now major NVA units up to regimental size to the south to attack, along with the main VC units there, the Southern forces to destroy them and overthrow the government. Indeed, when US forces began to deploy there, beginning in April of 1965 and then in force in July, the NVA units were ordered to then concentrate their attacks on them. The PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, or NVA High Command, actually assigned goals to the NVA units, the numbers of casualties they wanted them to inflict on US units in order to affect US public opinion. Interesting is to read some of General Tan's directives to his subordinates about how he explained how he envisioned to fight the Americans and how he envisioned that they could beat them. He emphasized that the Americans would not be able to fight effectively in the difficult terrain, particularly in their main attack in the central portions of Vietnam. And he said, especially, they would not be able to attack their hidden fortified base camps. And if they did, then, and the Americans threatened them, then they would be able to retreat across the borders. Now, he recognized that the Americans were going to be more powerful than the French. But like the French, the US would be unable to, he thought, commit enough forces to both defeat their main forces and protect the population. And that eventually US public would grow tired of the war as the French had, and they would seek to negotiate their way out of the war. Anyway, the '64-65 offensive eventually failed in its original goal because of the commitment of major forces throughout '65 up to and over 100,000 US combat forces in Westmoreland's scheme to stem the tide, and they were successful. Throughout the remainder number of years, combating US forces led to, in 1967, a stalemate that Lejeune was concerned about. Now, in this next map, the second to the right, shows the 1968 Tet Offensive. With that stalemate, Lejeune thought that a major offensive was necessary to prompt the South Vietnamese people to uprise against a corrupt government, and that would force the Americans to leave Vietnam. He would adopt a strategic concept for that offensive, drawn up originally by General Tan, who was still in the South, to first reinforce the NVA units along the border regions, where they were to engage the American units to draw them away from the cities. Then, at the beginning of Tet Holiday, the main and local VC units in the South, some reinforced by the NVA units, would concentrate on the population areas and attack key military and political locations in over 100 cities. The main targets were Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue. The communists fully expected that they would be welcomed by the South Vietnamese people, who would have been incited to rebel by the VC political cells. Of course, this uprising never happened. And to the North's surprise, the South Vietnamese army and even their local militias, along, of course, with the American units, fought well. And they produced a major military defeat on this combined offensive, which, having started in January, Lejeune continued until October of that year. That defeat was so decisive that Lejeune had to order his armed forces in the South to disperse, avoid combat as much as possible, while the NVA reconstituted itself and its forces in the South through infiltration to replace their devastating losses. Now, the third map shows the 1972 offensive that Lejeune realized that he would have to launch based on two reasons. The first is that he felt that now he would be able to defeat the armed forces of the South and to create the fall of his government, as he tried to do previously. But he had to do it now because he became aware of the Nixon-Kissinger diplomatic initiative to disrupt the relationship of the North with its critical allies, the Soviets and the Chinese. So he felt, Lejeune, that now was the time yet to seek another military solution. And besides that, the Americans had already withdrawn most of their combat forces from the South, and the South's forces had performed badly in their February-March 71 invasion of Laos. Once again, as shown on this map, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was critical in order to mass the forces and provide them for this offensive. And besides that, almost the entire offensive was made up of NVA forces who possessed significant heavy armor and mechanized units with equipment given to it primarily by the Soviets. However, once again, Lejeune and his main generals miscalculated. They did not realize that American air power, directed by significantly still present US advisors, would be so devastating. And once again, the South's armed forces would fight determinedly. In fact, the NVA lost almost its entire armored force. This gets us to the fourth and final map on the far right. Depicts the final offensive in 1975. This time, once again, the North used the trail complex to reinforce its forces in the South. Those reinforcements, however, moved much deeper to assembly areas in the South than they had done before. What allowed them to do so was that the Paris Peace Accords had allowed the North to keep its forces throughout the South in areas that they had never had before. Another advantage was that the North had was that the U.S. was unable now to employ formidable air power because the Nixon administration was no longer in power and the U.S. advisors were no longer there to help direct it. The result, of course, was a rapid defeat of the South and the North's war for unification won. At the end of this part of the presentation, what my book emphasizes in going through all of this is that there are key aspects of the North strategy and operations are depicted here. First, every one of them depended on the Ho Chi Minh Trail for movements of troops and supplies to conduct these offensives. Without it, and then, by the way, the PAVN's official history admits to this, without it, the North could never have waged war in the South successfully. Secondly, in every one, to include the 64 offensive, the North depended upon its regular forces to be the major force that would lead to victory. The VC units were important, yeah, but it was the regular forces that Hanoi's leaders depended upon to enable the defeat of the enemy. Third, these operations, with the exception of the first, benefit from pauses administered by the U.S. or a lack of threat from American air power, allowing the buildups and movements. Where are you? There you are. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the formulation of U.S. strategy for the war. Here you should notice that the title of this and the next slide is the search for a strategy. That's because the overall view expressed in my book on the U.S. strategy for Vietnam is that from the national level, with the exception of the Nixon administration, we never really had a strategy for the war. A major reason for that is captured in the top two bullets of this slide. When Robert McNamara became Secretary of Defense in '61, Kennedy's main charge was to bring the Department of Defense under control for its programming and spending. McNamara instituted a programming and budget system still in vogue today based on systems analysis. The main tenet of this was that to justify a program, you needed to demonstrate its cost effectiveness. And to do that, you need performance measures along with cost analysis to assess the program. This is the management system he had practiced as president of Ford Motor Company before he came to the position. As I recount in my book, within a year, he, along with several other key managers he brought in with him, were very successful in establishing that system. So much so that he thought he could apply it to all the military's activities, even to its use of force in various conflicts. What gave him the confidence that such an approach, enhanced by game theory and conflict management techniques then in vogue in the academic world that his assistants were experts at, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In managing that crisis to a successful conclusion, McNamara felt that military strategy, which, by the way, he knew nothing about, was outmoded. Hence his quote on the second bullet right after the crisis was over. Indeed, McNamara's approach to Vietnam and executing first JFK's counterinsurgency there was to manage it through a series of performance measures, such as growth of the South Vietnamese armed forces, numbers of strategic hamlets built, numbers of operations conducted, etc. He actually rejected a plan that Sing Pak and that Paul Harkins had developed in Vietnam that was actually a military strategy. Hence, when asked in 1962, however, by a reporter, how they were doing in Vietnam, he replied, as you see in this third bullet. Of course, in November of '63, both JFK and Diem, the president of South Vietnam, were assassinated. And South Vietnam turned for the worse. As we know, LBJ took over, but he kept on not only McNamara, but most of JFC's key staff and cabinet members. Hence, what McNamara and the Department of Defense had depended upon what came over to the LBJ. There was one significant change, however. McNamara and Kennedy had been very unhappy with their military advice during their administration. With both of them, and with bystander LBJ, believed that the generals were too wedded to their World War II experiences and not in tune with the new world they faced with the advent of nuclear weapons and the use of Kennedy's idea of flexible force. So when LBJ took over, he followed the advice of McNamara, as shown in the Bullet 4, and went about to find generals who were more managers than gladiators. Though the new set of generals were still World War II generals, they were chosen based on their ability to manage processes that McNamara had already set up and demonstrated, and they had demonstrated their ability to cooperate and follow orders from their civilian superiors. Such was the case when the critical period came up in the beginning of 1965, when it appeared that South Vietnam may fall to North Vietnam offensive. LBJ now had to make a choice on what to do. Though he had proclaimed he did not want war and portrayed himself in the 1964 election as a peace candidate, he declared to everyone now that he wouldn't be the first president to lose a war. He also told his close associates in the Senate that he was afraid that a war would detract from what he was really interested in for his legacy. And that was the Great Society domestic programs that he sought to bring about the greatest social improvements in America since Roosevelt's New Deal. As I describe in the book, McNamara had the solution: apply limited force to send signals to North Vietnam leadership that the U.S. was serious in its pledge to keep South Vietnam a non-communist state. After all, McNamara thought, and LBJ agreed, Ho Chi Minh seemed to be a rational man who accepted a negotiated compromise solution at Geneva in '54. Faced with the situation that he may now have to face the greatest superpower in the world, he certainly would back down. And the use of air power, closely controlled by the president and the secretary, to avoid any widening war with China was ideal to use. Hence was born the use of air power strikes, closely controlled and calibrated after the Tonkin Gulf episode, and then increased into a full-strength bombing campaign, again, closely controlled and restricted over the North, called Rolling Thunder. By the beginning of March, however, it had become apparent to LBJ that these controlled and restrictive airstrikes could not convince the North to stop its aggression. Reports kept coming in that South Vietnam was about to fall. His hopes were stricken down. He now realized that U.S. ground troops would have to be committed in some numbers, somewhere and somehow. So his guidance to McNamara and his generals was shown on this slide. And he repeated it over and over and over. It's the only guidance basically he ever gave to the generals. I want to kill more BC. Now, to do this, LBJ decided to send the Army Chief of Staff at the time, General Harold K. Johnson, to Vietnam to report back, and in the president's words, get things bubbling. Johnson and Westmoreland met in Saigon. They talked over the situation, and they decided what was needed to stem the tide of the communist advance. When Johnson came back, he reported to LBJ, McNamara, and the Joint Chiefs that it will take about 500,000 troops, 5 years to turn everything around. And that included sending 3 or 4 divisions into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail to isolate the battlefield in the south. McNamara and LBJ, to say the least, are startled. McNamara says no one was thinking in those terms. Now things get interesting. As I found out in my research, as Johnson administration debates committee ground forces, his trusted assistants, not only McNamara and his trusted assistants, not only dominated the debate, but they carefully controlled and eliminated or downgraded the influence of the military advisors, particularly the JCS. He and his assistants come to the conclusion that all is needed is a more serious signal to convince the North to cease its aggression. He convinces the president to step up the bombing a bit, deploy some Marine and Army forces already in the Pacific to coastal conclaves in South Vietnam. He believes, McNamara, now that the communists wouldn't dare persist in their attacks after the U.S. has committed ground troops. So in April and May of '65, Marine brigades and an Army separate airborne brigade go to Vietnam. The deployment of these forces, however, do little to stop the North, and the enemy's main forces continued to deal serious blows to the south. In June, Westmoreland sends what McNamara now calls a bombshell message, calling for the immediate deployment of 44 ground combat battalions and logistic units to stem the tide, or else the South will fall. That's about 120,000 troops. He also writes that additional forces may be necessary later to defeat the enemy, and that it would be a long war, maybe as much as 5 years. Bombarded by these reports and shaken by what his generals were telling him, LBJ tells McNamara in the beginning of July that he wants a guarantee that if he commits ground troops, these numbers he will win. General Earl Wheeler, the chairman and Joint Chief of Staff at the time, after a study is done, named the Goodpester study, named after the Joint Staff Director at the time, who headed it, and he handed this study to McNamara on the 15th. It says to produce a reasonable chance of success, if the administration does all that's necessary, the study says we have a reasonable chance to win. It calls for over 500,000 troops to once again deploy to South Vietnam, with some of the forces employed in Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while others are employed to operations to destroy, along with the South Vietnamese Army, isolated enemy soldiers in the South, isolated from any reinforcements from the North. McNamara is not pleased, as you can imagine. He's concerned that the planned strategy will require full mobilization and risk Chinese intervention. McNamara then sends his report without an endorsement, really, to the National Security Assistant, Big George Bundy, saying it's just another study from the Joint Staff. It sits on Bundy's desk and never seen again. At the end of July, the president makes a major announcement to the American people that he's going to deploy forces to South Vietnam. He says there may be some to follow. He tells McNamara there will be no mobilization. He wants to limit ground operation to South Vietnam. He emphasizes that these limits avoid Chinese intervention at all costs. Once again, McNamara drafts and issues performance measures to gauge progress, the major one being kill more enemy than he can replace in South Vietnam to convince him he cannot win. McNamara goes to the president and recommends a bombing halt to induce the North to negotiate after he was denied victory in the South. We all know the results of these decisions over the next 3 years. Without a national strategy for victory, with clear military aims that could force the North to stop its aggression, a stalemate ensues, and then Tet 68 occurs. LBJ refuses to run again for the president. A bombing halt is altered, and the U.S. and North Vietnam meet in Paris to begin peace negotiations. Now, I will get, because some of you have asked some questions about where does Tet 68 fit in all of this, but much of the strategy in Vietnam, particularly the Westmoreland theater strategy of attrition, is portrayed in the history books as a dead start, as one that from the beginning ensured our defeat in Vietnam, especially the earlier strategies of the Orthodox historians. But what they ignore is that the U.S. military did do some reassessments of their strategy during the war. So what I want to do is to show you two major contingency plans that I describe in my book that address these strategic reassessments that the U.S. contemplated, particularly around 1967, and then after Tet that may have made the outcome different in the war. I want to emphasize may have, because there's really no way we could know for sure. There are just too many variables in war, as most of you know, to say with certainty that these alternatives would have worked. Nevertheless, I describe these new approaches in my book because they demonstrate that the US military was aware that the course of attrition that they were forced to by LBJ and McNamara was not a decisive course. In fact, Westmoreland understood that it was making the war longer and causing more needless casualties than an alternative one, and risked losing public support. He recognized this in late 1966. So this slide shows two graphics. Westmoreland is the one, the graphic on the left is the contingency that Westmoreland and his staff had developed. The one on the right is the one that Wheeler, as the chairman, and his staff developed. On the left is Operation Plan El Paso. Late in '66, intel reports showed that the North was able to infiltrate enough forces along the trail to the south to replace its losses, negating the performance measure that McNamara had assigned to Westmoreland and that was being closely watched in Washington. The MACV commander realized if he continued, he'd not be able to reach that crossover point. He was seeking to kill more BC than they could replace. So he directed his staff to develop his contingency plan to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail and routes with ground forces to prevent further reinforcements. That plan came up with this El Paso, envisioned a core level attack with 3 divisions out of a base camp in Quezon to seize a key road intersection at Chapon in Laos. To execute the plan, Westmoreland realized he would need not just more combat forces, but significant logistics forces to support and sustain a core level attack, particularly if they wanted to stay in Laos for an indeterminate time. So beginning in '67, he began to send messages to Washington to set the stage for a change of his strategy to execute the plan. These reports consistently assessed that with the pace of infiltration increasing each year, coupled with his inability to corner the enemy's main forces, who were able to escape destruction by moving across borders, the war could continue for at least 5 years more with more significant casualties. In March '67, he submitted an enhanced reinforcement plan, a package that included just over 200,000 troops than he had originally projected. These were additional forces he needed to execute El Paso. When McNamara saw this package, he immediately sought it, killed it, said that it would require mobilization, it cost more money than we can afford, and besides, his team said the kill ratios wouldn't really give us much more, so it died. On the right-hand side, there's a schematic of Operation Muleshoe, a similar idea by General Wheeler that he'd be able to influence the outcome of the war more decisively than if they continued on. This one envisioned the conduct of a limited but combined air, sea, and land offensive, lower portion of North Vietnam, just north of the DMZ, and it was going to defeat the significant NVA buildup there of regular forces who have been conducting attacks. The operation envisioned airborne assaults, marine amphibious lodgement, and an overland attack. However, and it would take about the same size forces as Westmoreland. Wheeler, unlike Westmoreland, never shared this with McNamara, the president. He didn't discuss it with the MACV commander, and they also looked at it as a possibility after Tet. Now, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go through this a little bit faster and we can talk about it a little bit more. Let's take a look at Tet 68 as a turning point, and I'm going to emphasize some things here. Number one, was it a military defeat for the North? I've already said that in my book I do say so. One major reason is that in the official history of the North Vietnamese Army, victory in Vietnam, that was translated and edited and later published in 2005, I think, they actually admit that it was a major defeat. and later on have a Vietnamese operational commander by the name of General Tran Van Tra, who conducted the major attack in Tet against Saigon, was also very critical of the aim of the offensive. He said it was too ambitious. We didn't have enough time. And by the way, he estimated we lost, or they lost, 45,000 PAV and VC troops, and that over the next couple of years, they had to replace nearly 70% of the VC unit ranks with PAV regulars afterwards. Well, how did Lizuan? Lizuan realized, even though he had continued to conduct attacks after the initial attack, he knew that he'd have to agree to negotiate over this. So he would have to reconstitute his forces in the north, and then he'd have to reinforce and replace forces in the south. So in fact, he recognized that it was a military defeat, but it was a temporary one, in his view, because it never took advantage of. The US never followed up with a major military action that would cut his lifeline, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, the main question, however, is in the second bullet that I try to take on in my book, is that why didn't we follow on? What happened, of course, is that our president seemed to produce some sort of political retreat when he withdrew from further seeking the presidency and calling for negotiations. Well, I'll bet, why did that happen? I'll bet some of you are probably saying, well, we know why. It's because the press and the media sold us out, but it's not that simple. For certain, the reporting of the press was inaccurate and inflammatory. Peter Preystrup, himself a reporter at the time, called out his fellow reporters and criticized them for distortion of reality. And he said that from the beginning, Tet attacks represented a disaster for the US and South Vietnamese military as manufactured by the press. It created an atmosphere in Washington that propelled the administration into confusion and a frenzy to try to find out what happened. Overall, it produced a sense of defeat in the war, that how it was going. But he offered something very interesting. He offered a critique of the way President Johnson handled this situation. He wrote, Lyndon Johnson willy-nilly helped create these conditions that led to this failure. Johnson did not give the news media or the public a coherent scenario for what was going on. In that sense, the president's political crisis in Washington after Tet was a self-inflicted wound. In other words, LBJ simply withdrew from public view. Things got out of hand. Now, the irony associated with this withdrawal or absence is that public opinion polls, I found, were in support of a major military decision. Most Americans still in support of our involvement there. The Harris and the Gallup polls showed that 74% in February of Americans had confidence in their military. 53% of them polled thought the war was not being fought aggressively enough and should be. So what's most astonishing that I try to lay out in the book about Tet as a political defeat is that we needed strong leaders at this time. And yet the two leaders of the war, McNamara and LBJ, had breakdowns. McNamara broke down in sobs, crying in one meeting, contemplating the reinforcements. He said, stop this madness now. And he withdrew. Johnson's closest friend to the Senate, Richard Russell, came by to visit in the White House to find out how he's doing. Found the president crying, slumped in his chair, mumbling, how could everyone turn against me? So when the military then came to a follow-up, and they asked again for these over 200,000 troops, no one would listen to them. Any major military counterforce operation was dead in its tracks. Now, I'm going to go by very quickly here, and I'm just going to show you some slides. The relationships matter. The relationship between American civilian military leaders and advisors throughout this period was fraught with misunderstandings, mistrust, and even disdain. The resulting atmosphere, in turn, created a dysfunctional decision-making environment that ignored the enemy's capabilities and intent and failed to produce a coherent, agreed understanding of what actions were necessary to obtain U.S. stated objectives of defending South Vietnam. These are some of the quotes during the JFK and LBJ that show you how these are not, by the way, from their memoirs. They are from the presidential tapes. It was more, and although I did not cover Nixon, it actually got worse during the Nixon administration, so bad that he threatened to get rid of the entire JCS in '72 during the Easter Offensive, and as commander-in-chief, run the war personally with his military assistant, or rather Kissinger's military assistant, General Haig. And then later, actually wanted to remove Abrams, fire him from his job, but was talked out of it by the Secretary of Defense. So I'm going to stop it here, because I want to get to some questions.
Okay, if you want to submit your questions, I'll pass them on over to Colonel Rothmann. Right now, we still have none.
Come on, Tom Ferguson.
Oh, someone raised a hand, but I don't see the question. All right, still no questions. So, oops, here we go. From Randall, Tenor, was Walter Cronkite's view as significant as portrayed?
In much of the history, it's portrayed that LBJ actually watched Walter Cronkite's report on the war, suggesting that we withdraw our military commitment, we negotiate. That we tried the best that we could, and we just, as best as we tried, we failed, and we need to get out as a way, just negotiate out. There's some question whether or not LBJ actually saw that, particularly the Cronkite view, but it is well known, as I mentioned, LBJ did watch television all the time. He had 5 or 6 sets set up in the Oval Office. He was always aware of what or tried to know what the temperature of public opinion was and of the news and so on and so forth. So later on in his biography of Doris Kearns, Goodwin, he admitted that all of the press, and particularly the press during Tet, really got him down, and that he grew tired of the conduct of the war. It was a major factor for him withdrawing from the president's nomination.
Okay. Tom does have a question. Tom asked, could you discuss more about the potential to deal a decisive blow versus the PAVN by the execution of Operation El Paso?
Well, naturally, the purpose of El Paso was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail by going across Laos. Now, as I tried to emphasize, this was not just that contingency plan, that this is something that had been emphasized all along from Johnson when he went and gave his report back on his visit in March of '65. Prior to that, even, Rostow, when he was the Assistant National Security Advisor, said that this may have to be done. The North is invading the South. It's a new kind of Korean aggression. And the only way we're going to stop it is to stop their lines of communications into there. So it appeared, and I agree with that it in fact would be decisive. It's like trying to fix a leak under the kitchen sink without turning off the water flow. I mean, and if you read the PAVN history, throughout the PAVN history, they talk about how the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the centerpiece of their strategy. Without it, they could not wage war in the South. So it certainly would have done, and I argue in my book, more than just cutting the trail. Based on what the North Vietnamese did in the Laotian offensive, Lam Son 719, where they massed their forces and engaged the South Vietnamese in February, March of 71, I argue that not only would it have cut the trail, but it would have attracted, the North would have reacted with major offensive. And therefore, the US would have been able to bring to bear all of its conventional and its air power and everything else and strike a decisive blow against the North Vietnamese army itself.
Next question is from Robert. Do you think American involvement in Vietnam saved Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia from communist takeovers, as the former Singapore premier once said?
A lot of the revisionist historians say so. Certainly, one of the reasons why we got involved in South Vietnam to begin with was because of the fact that, well, let me see, China fell in 49, it was Korea in 50. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and by the way, in the Philippines, there were insurgencies. And we now know, and it was stated at the time by Mao, that Mao as leader was in favor of supporting those. So number one, our involvement in Vietnam was very much, a reason for that was very much because of concern over these insurgencies. There are those who argue, I think it's impossible to know, but certainly you could say there's a cause and effect here. We got involved in Vietnam and these insurgencies failed. QED, our involvement led to that failure. Historically, I don't think you can make that argument because history is too fraught with things that it could have happened. I know that's a wishy-washy answer, but basically that's my viewpoint.
Another question from another Tom. Has your research concluded Vietnamese sources that have become accessible since the war, and how have these sources changed historiography concerning the war?
This is what I tried to cover in my last webinar, but had some technical difficulties, definitely. There has been a lot. I've mentioned one, and that's the release of the official history of the North Vietnamese Army, of the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam. Again, edited and published by Pribenow is his name, an ex-CIA officer. And even more important than that, there's a very interesting book recently published in 2012, I think it was, by Lien Hong Nguyen, a Vietnamese woman of birth, escaped in 75, has since become a professor of history at Columbia University and other places, and has had access to the Vietnamese archives and interviews with people who participated in the decision-making of North Vietnam during the time. Her book has been monumental in turning around the attitudes. I mean, it's really her work that revealed that who we thought were the decision makers, Ho and Giap, were not the real decision makers. During Tet 68, Giap wasn't even in country. He was in East Europe. And her portrayal of their decision-making process is just phenomenal. It's amazing. And so her work, plus others, there's a man by the name of Pierre Asenling, who also has now access to those archives, who just this last year published a book called Vietnam's American War, I believe it is. Very, very interesting book based upon, again, these archives. So they're changing the viewpoint, yes, decisively, I think, about the war, as they should be.
Okay. Next question is from Al. Do you have any opinion on how significant and how successful or unsuccessful the counterinsurgency doctrine, win the hearts and minds, was during the ongoing war, even after 1965?
Oh, let me see. Well, the very first thing is we did have some doctrine. We did have counterinsurgency in doctrine. In fact, there was a work done by and published, I think, as part of the U.S. U.S. Army Center of Military History on that traces the fact that we did have a counterinsurgency doctrine before we got involved, and it was actually being taught at some of the war colleges. Now, how effective was it? I think that whatever doctrine we went into, we certainly varied it. My experiences were, let me go to my experiences as a company commander and platoon leader. We were paired up with some popular force of militia forces in a village, in a series of villages in a hamlet, with these militia forces to actually bring some more effective counterinsurgency operations closer to the population. We mirrored what really the Marines had done up north. And that is the Marines had put together the CAP program, the Combined Action Program, where they put in a squad or a reinforced squad in certain villages tied with the popular forces there, and initially kept them there fairly permanently to give them security. And to various degrees, that was very, very successful. Now, having said that, the real question and the argument is, by some people, is that we didn't focus on counterinsurgency and the protection of the population. My argument is, as is some other historians and military people, is that you just couldn't focus on one. You had to focus on both the guerrilla war and the regular war, going after the main units, the NVA and main VC units, as well as trying to protect the population. You couldn't do one without the other. So I hope that offers somewhat of an answer to that question.
This question's from William. Why would the North have thought the population was on their side and just waiting to be freed, especially after Tet 68?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know if they were getting false information reports from their VC cadre, from their political. I think there was a plan by the VC infrastructure to assassinate the leaders, as they had been doing off and on. There had been, and actually a revolt in Northern I Corps in 1967, by 67, against the government, led by General T up there. So that may have given them indications. I'm awaiting actually a book by Professor Nguyen, the woman I told you about, the Columbia professor. She's writing a new book on the Tet Offensive. And she was supposed to publish it at the 50th anniversary. But obviously she's got more involved in it. And I hear that in a couple of months it's going to come out. And that may offer some very good insights into that question. I hope so.
This is a question from Brooke. You talk about elected officials' attitudes towards, or elected or appointed officials' attitudes towards some of the military leaders. What about the military leaders' attitudes and opinions of their civilian bosses?
Yeah, good question. Amongst, I say, the junior members in the Pentagon, when I was a colonel in the Pentagon, I was a junior member. It was quite bad. At the planner view, at the colonel, brigadier general level, it was terrible. Particularly with the two assistants, McNaughton and what was the other guy's name? I have it here. So, Endoven, who ran the systems analysis office. It was terrible. Now, it's interesting. In Westmoreland's memoirs and in a post-war interview, he mentioned the fact that he was glad he wasn't in the Pentagon. He had to deal enough with both Endoven and McNaughton and Westmoreland. So my take on that is that Westmoreland wanted nothing to do with these people who were doing nothing but measuring, using numbers to measure the progress of the war. I think that Wheeler had a little bit of a different view. He knew that numbers were important in the Pentagon. After all, he was the chairman. But he wanted to be able to deal with that and take advantage of it and somehow manipulate it in order to get these reinforcements to reinvigorate the strategic reserve and so on and so forth. As a matter of interest, I found out that Wheeler, who's always been somewhat of an enigma and a mystery throughout this, because he'd left there's no memoirs, no papers, until we found out recently that indeed he had papers that his family had, and they gave them to a military colonel, former actually director of the Heritage Foundation, who's now writing a book and going to be released on Wheeler. I'm anxious to find out what that has to say about his attitudes and how he went about it.
This is from Al. Would it have been possible to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail by air power alone?
I'm a ground pounder, so the answer is no.
No.
They did try. I mean, there were almost, and I don't know of my figures here, but almost as much, if not more, bombs that were dropped on the Ho Chi Minh Trail as on the north. There was a massive air interdiction campaign that went against the trail. But it's interesting to read the accounts of some of the North Vietnamese, both the captured accounts when they were captured and some of the accounts that are coming out now. All they did was go around whatever, if the bridge was out, if a defile was filled in, they just go around it. Now, by the time of Abrams, they knew a lot, they were able to know a lot more about what was coming through the trail, but they were unable to cut it. So my own view is no, is that they had to have a ground interdiction permanently.
Colonel Rothmann, this will be our last question. I think it's a good one. This is from Barbara. She says, what's the most important leadership lessons for the 21st century military and civilian leadership that we can take from the Vietnam War?
How important it is to have good civilian military relations in which there's trust and a realization, in war particular, that in order to come up with good plans, the employment of military force, you have to have a sense of shared responsibility, trust, and respect. Without that, you'll never be able to have the dialogue that's necessary to listen to all of the experts and all the people who know about the ramifications of employing force. And I'm not just talking about the ramifications, the military ramifications, but I'm talking about the political and cultural ramifications. For example, when I was a strategic planner for General Powell during the first Gulf War.
Alert from Google Chrome. You don't need Viagra.
Oh, God. I hope nobody heard that one. Anyway, as my experience as a strategic planner for General Powell in the first Gulf War, we were looking at a national strategy for the Gulf War. And one of the things we looked at is in going into Kuwait, what did we want to do? And how would we be able to do it? And so on and so forth. And the question came up as some people were pushing for, was to go into Iraq and take out Saddam Hussein. Well, the National Security Council meetings that I sat in on had some experts about who's the Sunnis and the Shias. And when we heard about the problems between the Shias and the Sunnis and what that would cause after, if we went in militarily to take out Saddam Hussein and we take over ownership of Iraq, we didn't want anything to do with that when we went to General Powell and we talked about that. So that cooperation between the civilian experts and the State Department experts who knew something about the Shia-Sunni problem and the military people who would then go back to those who are then going to the president was critical to what went on there. So again, the most important leadership lesson is take the lead in ensuring that there is shared responsibility and strategic formulation between the civilian superiors and leaders and the military advisors and commanders.
I want to thank everybody for joining today. I will attempt to download the remaining questions and pass it over to Colonel Rothmann. We hope you enjoyed both his talks. And again, if you want to watch this again, we'll be posting it onto YouTube within the next 3 or 4 days. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.